We are currently in the middle of a 5-part series, The Battle for Morale, here on the U.S. Homefront during World War II. Because when we imagine the American homefront, the picture often seems clear and inspiring. You can imagine factory whistles blowing as workers pour into massive plants that are producing tanks and aircrafts. Women stepping into the industrial jobs like Rosie the Riveter. You can imagine families planting victory gardens in backyards and city parks. You can see communities saving scrap metal and rubber to support the war effort. And the story we often hear is one of unity and determination, a nation fully mobilized and standing together. And in many ways, that story is 100% true. But the reality of wartime America is so much more complicated because behind the patriotic posters and radio speeches, the American homefront faced enormous pressure and morale was constantly tested. Fear, exhaustion, social tensions, shortages, and even enemy propaganda all threatened to weaken the national spirit that the war effort depended on. Hello to all the Rosies and Homefront Joes, and welcome back to another episode of On the Victory Homefront. In this third episode of this 5-part series, we are looking at one of the most visible ways that war changed everyday life in America, and that is through grocery stores, gas stations, and ration books. Because during World War II, nearly every American household had to learn how to live with shortages.
Stories from the home front bright, keeping victory shining light on the victory home front.
After the United States entered the war in December of 1941, the country's economy rapidly shifted to support the military. Factories that once produced automobiles began producing tanks, jeeps, aircrafts. Steel, rubber, fuel, and food were redirected toward the war effort. This massive mobilization created a problem because there simply were not enough goods available for both the military and civilian population. So to make sure the armed forces had what they needed, the government created the rationing system. And the idea was simple. Essential foods would be limited so that they could be distributed fairly. And every American would share in the sacrifice. The gasoline was one of the first items to be rationed, and that's because rubber was in short supply due to the Japanese forces that had captured many of the world's rubber-producing regions. And so tires became difficult to replace. So gasoline was rationed to encourage drivers to limit their travel and to carpool whenever possible. Now, food was also rationed, and we went through the whole rationing system in April and early May on how families would have gotten their very first ration book. And so beginning in 1942, Americans were issued these ration books, and they were filled with stamps. Each stamp allowed a household to purchase certain items in limited quantities. And without the correct stamp, that item could not be bought. Items such as sugar, meat, butter, coffee, and canned goods were tightly controlled. Grocery shopping required careful planning, and families had to decide how to use their stamps wisely. So for many Americans, I would say most Americans, this was a completely new way of living, and they had to adapt to these shortages. So Americans responded to rationing with creativity and determination. Victory gardens became popular across the country. Families grew vegetables in backyards, vacant lots, and community spaces, and these gardens helped supplement rationed food supplies. People also learned how to stretch ingredients, and recipes changed. Butter might have been replaced with substitutes. Margarine, for example, came into play, and sugar became precious. Leftovers were rarely wasted, and repairing and reusing items became common practice. Clothing was patched and mended. Old household items were kept in use longer than before. So for many families, though, these sacrifices became a source of pride because they believed their efforts at home directly supported the soldiers fighting overseas. But wherever shortages exist, another system sometimes appears: The black market. Black markets involved the illegal buying and selling of rationed goods outside of government regulations. In some cases, merchants quietly sold extra supplies to favored customers. And farmers occasionally sold food directly without requiring ration stamps. Gasoline coupons were also sometimes stolen or forged. And meat became one of the most common black market goods. Customers willing to pay higher prices could sometimes obtain steaks and other items that were difficult to purchase legally. For Americans who carefully follow the rationing rules, this was deeply frustrating because the entire system depended on fairness. Everyone was supposed to sacrifice equally. And when people saw others cheating the system, it threatened the sense of unity that rationing relied upon. Now, the government took black markets very seriously. Officials worried that if the public lost confidence in the rationing system, cooperation would collapse. So campaigns were launched encouraging Americans to report illegal sales. Posters warned citizens not to participate in the black markets, and inspectors investigated businesses suspected of violating ration rules. Penalties could include fines or loss of business licenses, and these efforts helped keep the black market from growing too large. But the problem never completely disappeared. Now, how did all this impact morale? Well, despite these challenges, most Americans accepted rationing as part of the war effort, and they understood that soldiers overseas depended on supplies. So, sharing the burden at home became a way of contributing to victory, but rationing also created daily reminders of the war's demands. There were long lines, empty store shelves, limited choices, and these small frustrations added up over time. And as the war continued year after year, the strain began to show. Because while rationing demonstrated the strength of American cooperation, it also tested the patience of the home front. The irony of this episode coming up this week is crazy for me because right now I am very deep into my own personal victory garden, and I just started to harvest some of my garlic a little early because my garlic is not doing well. Now, I'm grateful that I am not in a rationing system right now, so I can get garlic at the store. I can get garlic from a local farmer. Maybe that would have been considered the black market back in the day, but I am not dependent on my garden. But if I were, I can't imagine the stress and strain. I'm already stressed about it and I'm not depending on it. But this also shows that for millions of Americans, the war was not only something they heard about on the radio, it was something they experienced every time they stepped into their victory garden, every time they filled a gas tank, bought groceries, or repaired a worn out pair of shoes. Rationing became one of the most visible signs that the entire nation was at war. It demanded sacrifice, it demanded patience, and it demanded trust that everyone was doing their part. But rationing and shortages were only one source of pressure on the American home front, which is why we are doing a 5-part series. Now, in the next episode, we'll explore the tensions and divisions that sometimes erupted within American communities during the wartime. There were riots. There were racial conflicts because even in a time of national crisis, the United States was still struggling with deep social divisions. So I hope you will join me as we continue this 5-part series. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, share with your friends and family to help my audience grow. And remember, my friends, that victory is in the everyday. See you next time.